Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here, and I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about forward panics and the risks to law enforcement officers and protesters during the Occupy Wall Street scenarios. My main purpose of providing this brief presentation is in hope that protesters and law enforcement officers and city officials actually think through some of the problems that could occur if things turn so tense that violence occurs. I would hope that we can set in motion some policies, some procedures, some levels of knowledge to prevent any law enforcement officer or any protester from getting injured or killed. I have a great fear that we're going to see these protests become nasty, violent, and we're going to see possibly injuries and even loss of lives, and one injury and one loss of life, in my opinion, is a tragedy and very preventable and avoidable. I'm going to briefly discuss the work of Randall Collins, an amazing sociologist who has written this book, Violence, a microsociological theory, and it's published by Princeton University Press. And I'm going to briefly address a chapter called Forward Panic that addresses basically law enforcement officers and crowds and the interaction that can occur and when things can occur that become violent. I would highly recommend anyone leading a protest consider purchasing this book or getting it from the library and reading it, especially the chapter on Forward Panic. And I highly suggest that police chiefs and sheriffs and public policymakers actually get a hold of this book and read it and share the information, and maybe contact Professor Collins and ask him. He's the expert. I'm just read the book and have a little bit of knowledge and find it extremely sensible and useful. But basically, a forward panic is where there's conflict that starts to build, and as the conflict builds, the groups begin to feel tension and fear combined, and as this tension and fear begins to escalate, it can turn into violence. What can happen between protesters and law enforcement is that over a period of time, tension begins to build, fears begin to build. From both law enforcement and protesters' perspectives, you can understand the uncertainty of interpreting what the next move is going to be, and the anxiety and the ambiguity of what one should do next without being able to predict with any accuracy what's going to happen next with the other party. But a panic can occur when this tension and fear builds up into a frenzy. In other words, according to Professor Collins, the tension and fear is transformed into a frenzied attack. And even though Professor Collins focuses primarily on police attacking citizens and protests and crowds, when things start getting out of hand, I will go ahead and focus on the interactional aspects, with the idea that both groups can get into forward panic, and this could lead to disaster, massive violence on interactional level that leads to loss of life and many injuries. So if we look at this whole idea, though, of forward panic, Professor Collins talks about two major characteristics: this hot emotion that's building, and also repetition. So once violence begins, even a small level of violence, what can happen is it will escalate, and then it becomes a frenzy. A beating starts, and then the beating becomes worse, and then more people get involved in the beating. It becomes a violent, interactional episode of mutual aggression. And even though Professor Collins talks about when one group gains total domination, they are able to go ahead and get into this forward panic, when his focus is primarily soldiers or law enforcement that would get involved in attacks on citizens, I'm taking the perspective that you could have either or both sides get into this scenario. That you could have basically the protesters become violent and go after the law enforcement officers, and the law enforcement officers become violent and go after the protesters, and this might occur simultaneously, or law enforcement officers might step back and try to calm the situation, or when law enforcement officers are getting into that frenzied state about to be called a forward panic, then the protesters can step back and try to calm the situation as well. But we have to be very aware of the situation. I think where Professor Collins talks about situations holding is standoffs, and that's what you see right now are standoffs. Basically, you see that the tension. You can see the tension just by watching, what's going on television. You can feel the tension if you hear from law enforcement officers or protesters. Again, if you think about it, you could actually have a protester that's also a law enforcement officer, and think of the dilemmas there and the role conflicts. But Collins points out that we need to be very aware also of rumors that occur that may lead to this frenzy, forward panic, violent situation.